Hi, I'm Hannah.
Hi, I'm Abby.
And this is Filling Ink,
The Inksel podcast.
We're back for season 2, episode 3.
We are, yeah. Basically, well, at the midpoint of the season, because we extended it. We now have 5 episodes for the season, because we like making it harder for ourselves.
We do. We just kind of felt like we needed that little episode at the end to summarise what was a fantastic first season.
Yeah.
So we thought season 2, we'll extend it a little bit.
Yeah, see how it feels.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so last week we talked to Gareth, who is your pal.
He is. It was a fantastic conversation. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I just kind of came away with a completely different perspective on editing after speaking to Gareth, just because I wasn't aware of the various kind of guises that editing and forms editing can take. So I feel like I really did. I looked at my work a lot differently. I kind of was looking at it through the eyes of Gareth.
Ooh.
If that made sense, because he gave
Spooky.
us some really interesting insights, didn't he?
He did, yeah. I mean, I just had a fantastic time just listening to him, because it was just like my first kind of, I don't want to say exposure, because that's not the right turn of phrase, but like my first interaction with Gareth.
Yeah.
And it was just so useful to actually think about like both the novel I'm working on outside this the podcast, and actually the project I'm looking for with the podcast. And it was quite nice having both time to enjoy both of them. But yeah, it's just great. It's just like we both came away and we're just like, wow, we really enjoyed the conversation, which was nice.
Yeah, I think it gave me as well the level of ownership I felt I needed over my work, because in actual fact I thought I would create a first draft and then be like, right, it's over to the editor now. But in actual fact, Gareth was saying no, the vast majority of the work needs to come from the author. The editor, really, you're wasting your money and your time if you give them an unpolished piece.
Yeah, the onus is truly on you to make sure it's at that standard.
Yeah, so the level of honesty I think that we had in that conversation was, it was quite, I don't think anyone really would speak to you so directly and kind of gives you the honest truth.
Yeah.
So it was really good. It was fab.
Very candid.
Yeah, very candid. And I'm excited to see how this season progresses. And obviously now we're going to kind of go from talking to Gareth, who is an editor, to actual published poets and authors who have actually gone through the editorial process themselves.
Yeah, it's a good season. We just got lots of great people. I think we said this last season, we'll say it next season. We're very chuffed with the people we've invited on, which is quite nice.
Yeah, some really lovely guests.
But yeah, before we get there, shall we talk about our creative projects?
Yes, let's have a little bit of an update, how we're getting on. Do you want to start?
You always do this. You're always like...
it's tricky actually, because Gareth kind of came at it from a novel point of view, didn't he? So what did you manage to take from that conversation, really, and apply to your collection?
Yes. I guess I think there's two kind of sides I want to talk about. It's like the fact that for my novel it was really useful, which I don't know, it's like separatist, but like, I've finished, I'm at 106,000 words for the second draft, and like it is rough. Like I've had people be like, oh my gosh, I want to read it, and I'm like, no, we're not doing that. Like you will see it in time, because going back myself as a reader and rereading it, I'm just like, there are so many, like not even just plot holes, but like plot canyons. So I think talking to Gareth, because he talked about developmental writing, I thought it was really interesting, because I was like, oh, maybe that's where I need to go and have like this external pair of eyes, and listen to him be like, no, you need to have it a solid standard. I was like, okay, I am nowhere near a solid standard. Let's talk about like going back and like how we're going to restructure it and how I'm going to make this second draft significantly better than the third draft significantly better than the second. So that was really useful. And then for like the poetry collection, it was interesting because there's no secret that I really struggle with editing my poetry, and that's not because I'm like, it's just fabulous the first try. It's often because I workshop as I go along quite in sort of intricately. So by the time I get to the end and I've workshopped it, I have often reached a point where I don't want to fiddle with it, because I feel I've kind of like tailored it as I've gone along. But I really liked the idea of just like I think it was the line that you said at the end of the episode, which was like looking at it with an editorial eye, and actually like not just looking at it as a writer or a reader, but as an editor. And I never kind of considered that, because I'm not merciless. When people give me their work, I'm nice. Like I'm not cruel to people, but I am quite like, here's how I see this, here's how I do this. And like I've always I would love to be an editor in the book publishing industry, but not at the moment. But I'm quite like, I do look at the detail. I think I kind of inverted that and put it back on myself and was like, cool, okay, like let's have a look at this and actually reflect on this, and like not just be like, oh well, as a writer I know here's all stuff in the background that I know that I haven't translated, but I know this. And then as a reader I can figure out the flow and I can figure stuff out. Actually, as an editor who's looking like the nitty gritty and the detail, what's missing, what needs to get put in. I'm still writing poems alongside it, so it's actually become a really organic collection where I'm like, I'm writing, I'm drafting, I'm editing, I'm cutting all at the same time, which I really like. And I think when we laid out these creative projects, I really thought, no, I'm really linear. I'm gonna write the poems in the first season and edit them the second, in the third I'll be sharing, and it's really not ended up like that. It's become much more like this sort of like wonderful squishy organic mess that I'm like kind of wading through.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And as well, I kind of think with poetry, quite often we can just cut and change, can't we? We can like little bits of some poems we've written and kind of almost as though, I don't know if we've talked about this in season 1 in your notes page, kind of having lines that you really like and then coming back to them, and almost like they're pieces of a jigsaw that you're just waiting for the next line to come to you and then they'll fit together. So I think it is, I completely agree with you. I can imagine it's much, much harder to edit a collection of poetry, just because there is no linear process with writing a collection of poetry. It's whatever comes to you at whatever time. Whereas with a novel, you've pretty much got the story set out already, so you're just chipping away at that line, aren't you? That plot. So, no, I can imagine it's a challenge, but I'm glad you've kind of been able to take something from it, especially with the fact you've got that side project going with the novel as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to make a joke, be like, it's hard to call a 106,000 word novel a side project, is all I want to do.
Oh, yeah, so true.
But it's fun, and it's nice to have things to jump between, which I mean, classic. If I can't truly pantser my situation, I will sort of like pantser my approach and kind of do what interests me.
Yeah.
So yeah, how about you? How was the self-editing with your draft?
Yeah, I think, well, I've worked with Gareth before, haven't I? And so
lucky girl.
Yeah, and I'm part of Gareth's writing group. So in actual fact, I do find that eventually, if you go to these writing groups for long enough, as you write, you have their opinions in your head. So I'll write something down and instantly I'll know this person's going to pick me up on that. This person's going to tell me it needs more of this. And so in actual fact, once you go to these groups for long enough, you start to preempt their criticism. And that's actually, it's a fantastic thing. It's such a huge help, because rather than being in your own head, you then start to think about the thoughts of others.
Yep.
So it's been really helpful for me. That happened a lot in my master's degree, because we did a very similar kind of workshopping part. A huge part of the master's degree was writing a section and putting it to your peers and getting their feedback. And you write with their thoughts. And so, yeah, I find, in actual fact, a lot of the things that Gareth suggested I was doing already. However, I wasn't being critical enough. And I think I wasn't being brutal enough. And I think I was very much writing with the mindset of, it will all get sorted in the edit. It's fine.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, that's me being lazy and putting it on an editor. And in actual fact, I'd be paying an editor to do a job that I could absolutely do myself. So I think it was just being a bit more accountable and not just leaving all my messy mopping up for an editor to tell me something that I already knew. Like, this description doesn't work. You've literally got a billion typos here. I don't need an editor to tell me that. I just need to actually, take that accountability for myself. So
yeah,
I think it was just good to give us a bit of a change of mindset, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's it's just adding that extra. It's like editing lasagna in your head, and you're just slowly getting these different little tips and tricks and layers to like how you're going to approach your work. And I love the fact that we talked to someone who works in fantasy and sci-fi, and it's applicable to your novel, which is more. How would you describe your novel?
I mean, when people ask me, I just say, look, it's just about life. It's about real life.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, a social criticism.
That's great.
I imagine.
Yeah, that's good. And it also was applicable to my poetry as well, which is nice that it shows that, I mean, all writing is writing, and we don't really need, like, genre-specific tips and tricks.
It does help, though. That was one of the things that Gareth said, wasn't it? If you can find an editor who is very much an expert in, or passionate at least, in your field, in your kind of chosen genre, at the end of the day, any opinion is better than, no opinion at all. So
yeah, absolutely.
Did you do a little bit of research for some writing groups?
Yeah, I did. I emailed Gareth to join you.
Did you invite
to ask?
Can I join the crew?
Literally, I was just sat there. I was just like, I know a few of the members of your group, and I was just sitting there thinking, I actually really, through Inkspool, would love to hear their perspectives on stuff, and it was just nice having one. And I just liked his vibe so much. So I was just very cheekily like, it was lovely to have you on, but also, would you have space? And he hasn't got back to me yet, so we'll see what he says. But I checked in with you that I wasn't stealing your space. So
absolutely not.
Well, we work together a lot, so I don't want to.
Oh god, yeah, no, yeah. And I've taken a little bit of a step back from my writing group because exam season is upon us. Solidarity to any teachers listening to this, you will know what heavy
Horrendous.
time this is. So I'm currently just putting everything into the kids at the moment rather than my own personal work, which is just a very short sacrifice for a matter of weeks, and then as soon as that's over I'll be back working, chipping away at the novel.
Yeah, but I also looked at, and I can't remember who it was, if you do, from season 1, someone mentioned Laurie Bolger's writing groups. I don't know if it was Rosa or Faye. I heard them before, but I've actually booked one for the end of the month to try out and just have, I think it was like poetry in pajamas, which kind of just really up my street.
That sounds great.
And I'm gonna make, I have a sofa bed and I'm gonna make it up into like a big, like get the duvet out and put loads of pillows and have like nice snacks and just make it like a real evening for myself. So I'm gonna try that because I keep favoriting them and then I just never book it and it's so ridiculous.
I'm the worst for doing that. I put so many things in my calendar and I see things on Instagram and I save them, and when it gets to it I'm just lazy. It comes down to me being a lazy person.
But we're not, because like I was talking to my partner recently about we're looking at houses and we're looking at one that's like of our budget, and I was like, maybe if I picked up a side hustle, something to like do it, and he was just like, Abby, Inksville is your side hustle. And I was just like, oh yeah, and he was like, no, seriously, like the work we do on this is enough. So
it's true. I just think sometimes we do kind of overwhelm ourselves with things, don't we, with to-do lists, so it's just to then add more things into the mix, it's a lot. But there are so many things that I would love to do. I mean, there are so many events around us, we are blessed. We talked about this a lot, but we have with so many poetry nights, literature nights around us, open mics, workshop spaces. However, just kind of finding the time to go to
work
this
full time.
is tricky.
Got a load on. We're only human.
We are.
Did you ever look for any groups, or are you just surviving that exam season?
The one for me for now is fine. I mean, exam season is a lot anyway, but also we have Inkspo once a month, so that's a really nice opportunity for me to get some feedback on poetry. And then I have the Write Club, which is a really good opportunity for me twice a month to get some feedback on my novel. And do you know what? That works for me at the moment. I think
sounds like enough.
And any more criticism, I think it would kind of maybe have the opposite effect. I think I'd get quite overwhelmed with things, because you do get to a point where you're listening to so many different people's opinions on the same piece of writing, and there's no way you can accommodate them all.
No.
So in actual fact, assessing which you're going to take and which you're going to leave can also be quite a job in itself. So just trying to lessen the workload for myself at the moment, to be honest.
Yeah, that's totally fair enough.
But shall we move on to focus on this episode? This week we've got a fantastic guest. I'll leave you to introduce him, because obviously you know him.
We're acquainted. Yes, today.
Somewhat acquainted.
Today we are joined by Adrian B. Earle, who is a writer and performer based in Birmingham. He's incredibly talented and incredibly lovely, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Shall I read his bio so that we can get the full flavour of him?
Yeah.
Because I think we've done that before. I think we rely on people checking our social media. And
well, not just that, people are modest. So whenever we have our guests, we're like, introduce yourself. And then afterwards we're like, they didn't say this, they didn't tell us this. And, it's they're too modest. They need to sell themselves more.
Yeah, okay. So, here we go. ThinkWriteFly is the creative outlet of Adrian B. Earle. Adrian is a writer, poet, and creative facilitator. He focuses on the quiet ways we can use language to shape ourselves, societies, and organisations. ThinkWriteFly is his moniker. As producer, filmmaker, sound shaper, tech experimentalist, and performer, he focuses on the fringes, the edges, and the ledges of media art, on the ways to break what we have to make new things. He is the author of 2 books, 5,000 Hertz, which was published by Burning Eye Books in 2017, and We Are Always and Forever Ending, which was published by Broken Sleep Books in 2019. We Are Always and Forever Ending going on to become a National Poetry Day pick in 2021. Didn't know that. That's very cool. As a filmmaker, his BBC commissioned poetry film Boy Shaped Space went on to be selected for the 2021 Film and Video Poetry Symposium, the Zebra Poetry Film Festival in Berlin, and won the Poetry Film category of the Newlyn PZ International Film Festival in 2021. So we'll make sure we tag all his socials and stuff on our socials, so people will find out more if they want to, or look at his website. But yeah, I mean, the stuff that I didn't know.
Yeah.
But Adrian is just so lovely. Should we go over a chat?
Yeah, let's go get to know him.
Hello, Adrian. Thank you so much for joining us on the Spilling It podcast. It's lovely to have you.
Wonderful to be here.
Would you mind, just for my benefit and the benefit of those listening, just introduce yourself, your writing, and just let us know who you are, what you're up to.
Sure. My name's Adrian Earle, also known as ThinkWriteFly when I'm producing and making film stuff. I'm a writer, a storyteller, poet, and thing maker. I tend to kind of abbreviate all the different hyphenates into that because it makes things easier. But my kind of philosophy is that to create stuff, when you're making art, you begin with the written word in its kind of most crystalline form. And when you get that down, usually via poetry, yeah, the world opens up.
Do you want to talk about your books as well?
Sure, yeah,
Those
I'm
things you did?
terrible at plugging. So I have two books, and my first, called 5,000 Hertz, is kind of like a micro collection based on the idea of hearing loss and tinnitus as a metaphor for trauma, and the pain that we inflict upon ourselves and others, often without meaning to. And my second, a collection of poems and short stories, just a bit longer, called We Are Always and Forever Ending, which is kind of obsessed, as I have been for a few years now, with the idea of endings and whether they exist at all, what they mean. And it's broken into kind of 4 sections: the end of me, the end of you, the end of us, and the end of the world. So I'm a bit of an odd poet because I like to be conceptual and find rules that work and break them. I like to cross-reference things that I create and write with odd bits of non-poeticness in the outside world, find ways to make the poems that I write echo in some way outside of just my own personal space and my own personal frame of reference, to kind of be something other than. I'm really bad at writing about myself, so, which is odd because some of the poems that people talk to me the most about are the poems that are really personal. I'm just like, I don't like doing that. But yeah. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, all good stuff. I have to admit, we are sat here with We Are Always and Forever Ending in front of us, because I just started it this morning, and I don't know why, but I read your. Actually, I know why. I was reading your dedications and your acknowledgements to check if you mentioned an editor, because prior to talking to you, I thought it would be good to check what was going on. That's why I ended up messaging you in the end. But oh my god, your dedications and your acknowledgements are beautiful. Like, they're so like they almost felt like poetry themselves, which was like really nice to read. I think maybe we don't always use dedications and acknowledgements as beautiful as we could. So yeah, good job on those. The writing was okay, but the the dedication and acknowledgement was just really good.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome. So, how do you edit your own work before working with an editor? Is our first question. And I thought it was quite pertinent, seeing as we've both looked at 5,000 Hertz, but I'm just starting The Horizon Forever Ending.
So, editing for me is a multi-stage process. When you're working on a collection, which is usually my kind of goal, even when I'm writing a commission, I very rarely write single poems. So I'll write poems either in sequence or poems in multi-parts. The idea is to kind of understand what the mechanism of the kind of the sequence or the collection will be, break it down to its component parts, understand what those parts need to do in and of themselves, and then kind of work from that upwards. So you end up with, like, from the idea that you're trying to explore with the collection to the idea that you're trying to explore with individual poems to what each individual poem will do, and then breaking that down even into what each line in the poem does to serve the function of the poem.
So very low key. You don't expect too much for yourself.
So like I don't know how common this is. It's uncommon amongst the poets I know, because we talk about it fairly often about the process. They're usually around 50-50. So you spend 50% of your time kind of writing and conceptualizing the poem. You get that draft down on the page. You're like, yeah, let's tie it and play with it. And you step away from it. And then spend about 50% of the time afterwards, same amount of time it took writing it, tweaking it, polishing it, re-editing it, reversioning it. I'm kind of like the 70-30. 30-70, in the sense that, like, I tend to write incredibly quickly. Nearly all of the poems of 5,000 Hertz were written. There was about a month's worth of writing, and I'd write poems in bursts, like 8-9 poems a week, and then take a break, and then 8-9 poems a week. Then each poem itself was probably worked on for about 6 weeks. poking, pulling, prodding, writing reversions, changing the structure entirely. There are versions of the poems that are completely unrecognizable from what ended up in the book because I was trying new experiments, seeing if I could figure out ways to use form or structure, hyphenation, things that I see other poets doing. I'm like, oh, that works to a particular effect. Could I try that with the poem that I've got here to see if it creates a similar effect? Because poems are machines, right? They take ideas and words and thoughts and images and they construct them in a particular way. And if you do it right and you tune it, you can pass that machine through time, and 400 years from now, somebody can read it and feel the same way that you've intended it. You kind of intended them to feel, though intention is a very loaded term. I personally, once a poem's written, like whatever it ends up being, it's out of my control now. It's in the world. But I think a poem works when if like multiple different people who I've never met come to talk to me about my work and have experienced a similar thing in it, I'm like, cool, that poem worked.
Yeah.
Because they have no contiguous frames of reference, and they definitely don't know me. So, but if they got it, if they got what I wanted to put out there, even if it's just interesting variations of, So editing tends to take a while. On the individual poem side of things, the first thing I'll do is get everything that I need to get in this poem down, to play with the ideas. And often it will be in whatever form feels happiest to me at that moment. Sometimes it's just fragmentary, just bits of ideas and phrases stacked on top of each other. Sometimes there'll be a music to it. I love working in pentameter. It's a weird thing to do.
Yeah, no, it's not really.
Yeah,
but it's like a really like artificial constraint that I'm just like, well, I'm just going to make this more difficult for myself.
Yeah,
but it finds like
you're giving yourself a harder job there.
But I find it as a really good way of kind of like clarifying how I'm thinking about something by forcing yourself. It's almost like I've done workshops where I've asked people to do poems as like back when Twitter was 140 characters as tweet exchanges.
Ooh.
Or another one is the American sentence in call and answer. American sentence is just like a haiku but squished. Ginsberg was like, haikus are too complicated, but I like the syllable count. And I mean, may have done many terrible things, but he did one thing right, which was developing the American sentence. And it works as a form. You end up with like these 17 syllables. And it has to be like a contiguous unit. And so you teach people that and they're like, yeah, I can do that. And they do an American sentence. I'm like, cool. Now write me a poem where each line is an American sentence and they're a call and response to each other in a conversation. And you create these kind of like structures. And the more weird structures that you create that kind of just like really arbitrary just games to play that force you to think a certain way, like that's how I write my poems. That's how I get my poems out.
I love that. No, I do. I'm thinking for like ink spill, we're hitting a point of like the threshold of poetry workshop activities and stuff like that is actually really interesting because I think we've got a good community now where they feel confident writing, but actually now it's time to like push them and make them uncomfortable when they're writing and see what that brings out of them. So I do really like it.
Well, if you ever fancy a spot, I'm more than happy to come and do workshops wherever. My workshops are very much in this. Let's poke things until they break.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's brilliant.
But yeah,
definitely take you up on that.
Yeah.
Once I've kind of had that play and I've got usually like a couple versions of a thing, like if you kind of think of it like the poem itself is a question and you're finding very multiple ways of answering the question. So you've got a couple of answers in front of you. Then you go like, what do I like from this answer? What do I like from this answer? What do I like from this answer? And then kind of mush them together. Maybe I like the form of this one, but like the words aren't sitting quite right. I really like that line. Maybe that should be the title. Or I like the way that ends, but like it gets a little bit messy in the middle. Or there was a random series of sounds that happened, like, you know, like an assonance or sibilance that happened in the middle of this one, but otherwise it's trash. And I'll be like, okay, cool. So I like this bit, and like this bit, and like this bit, and like this bit. And I'll try and build a poem that has all the bits of the other bits that I like to answer the same question. There's a guy who's one of my favorite poets called Douglas Kearney. He's actually a poet and librettist, and he's very much in the avant-garde of performance as well as the poetics on the page. Like, he breaks his poems up and smears them across the page. He's got this one of my favorite poems ever called Live Evil, which is named after the Miles Davis album of the same name. I'm a big jazz head. It's probably my age. But like, it also deals with the duality of Miles Davis being this like god tier musician, just genuinely did things that people didn't even conceive of the time, kind of created any type of form of jazz, modal jazz, and being an absolute unrepentant and documented misogynist, horrendous human being. Like, did things that are entirely unforgivable, and without question, like, he would brag about it, sort of thing. And how you countenance these two people, you know, there's this thing where it's like anyone with a conscience, you know, would finding out about what Miles did to Miss Seeley would break every Miles Davis CD they owned. But we don't. We don't, because we have this capability to somehow separate the sound, the quality, the ingenuity from the man. And the poem plays with this duality by making jazz from the descriptions of violence. It does it sonically, it does it structurally on the page. It creates a poem that almost is like bebop in its structure. If you get a chance, I will definitely like find a copy and send it in your general direction.
Yeah, please do. Because we can also
really cool to read.
Share that on the Inkspill socials and like show people, because like that's the joy of this, is meeting new people and learning stuff. So yeah, please send it across. That'd be great.
Definitely.
And it's a beautiful, beautiful poem, sonically as well as structurally on the page. And I don't get kind of poetic envy often, but occasionally Douglas Kearney will do stuff and I'm just like, God damn it. now everything's going to have to be put to one side. I'm going to spend a month trying to figure out how the fuck he did that. I'm sorry, I shouldn't swear.
No, you swear away.
Be comfortable.
No, I know exactly what you mean.
So that's the kind of the thing that I'll do. So I'll take all these facets and I kind of build things as a machine and figure out a way to kind of get the poem to embody the concepts that I'm talking about and I'm playing with. Because yeah, like for me, like, why waste an aspect of a poem? Why not have all the components of it, from the words on the page to the sound of the words to the structure within the white space to how it kind of like feels coming out of the mouth? Like, I want them all to kind of evoke the same or evoke something towards my goal. Because that for me is like a complete poem. Like, the sonnets work beautifully. There's this amazing thing of Dame Helen, not Helen Mirren. Oh my gosh, I got her name wrong. That's so bad. Judi Dench.
How dare you?
The Dench.
The Dench.
The Dench. Just casually just reeling off a Shakespearean sonnet on this chat show. I think it's like not Jonathan Ross, because he's been disgraced now, hasn't he? Can't remember, some chat show. And this is kind of like, she's sat between some pop starlet, some movie star, probably a punk rocker across the way, you know, the usual kind of rogues gallery. And then there's just the Dench in the middle, just being regal in her existence. Absolutely. And she just like, from memory, just reels off this sonnet, and the entire audience just shuts the fuck up. And it's just, and like, there's a moment after she finishes where like everybody's just holding their breath, and I'm just like, poetry snaps.
Yeah. Yeah, like the power of poetry. Actually, yeah, it can silence a room. We love that.
And I was just like, yeah, it's just amazing. But like, everything about those sonnets works to that effect. Like, I geek out about this stuff often. I geek about the romantics and about Shakespeare, not just because like it's part of the job, but like because I really do genuinely love it. It's kind of like when people talk about how beautiful like classical music is, but don't kind of see how it connects to like, you know, doom metal. Or the same way people will talk about how amazing, you know, the Byronic kind of like Petrarchan sonnets are, but like don't see anything redeemable in button poetry. And I'm like, my guys, you're missing it. Like both have beauty for particular reasons, and they're doing the same things in different ways. Like you gotta see that through line.
That clip from the Road to El Dorado, where it's like they're like both is good. It's like that kind of energy.
Yes,
both is good.
100%. So that's the structure of the poem that I do. That's how I edit. Just treat the poem as a question to answer, and find as many different ways as possible to answer it, and then find the bits of each answer that you like, and then build a brand new answer that's beautiful.
Yeah, that was very beautiful.
That was so
as well. It was brilliant.
Very poetic.
Yes, yeah. Okay, yeah, brilliant. So thank you for that insight. Obviously, you've kind of talked about your process of self-editing, but what do you find the most difficult part of that is then?
Ooh, now that's a difficult bit. Which of the darlings to kill?
Yes.
Because a poem can't be everything. It's just not enough. Sometimes you need to tighten up a line, and it means something to you. It makes you feel a sort of way, but you need to ask yourself, does it make you feel a certain way, or does it make the poem feel a certain way? Sometimes an image will just ride like roughshod over absolutely everything you're structuring the poem, and then you've got this urge to just make the poem about that image because it's just there. But then you're like, well, then write a different poem. Like, that image isn't the whole of the poem. Don't derail an entire process that you spent your time and energy on because this other shiny thing has popped into your kind of sphere of vision.
Yeah.
And sometimes, as much as you really want an experiment to work, it just kind of doesn't. And it might be really cool, and you might be like, oh, this is so delicious to have this poem based on the Fibonacci sequence, but if it like actually works, great. If it's just some words in a Fibonacci sequence with no hint or weight or value, just let it go. Put it back in the drawer. It might be beautiful later. It might grow. Poems are great. If you bury them, sometimes they grow into something else.
Yeah, very true.
So that's the hardest bit for me, because I used to be completely the opposite. My wife Anita used to just absolutely go ham at me because I just like toss entire notebooks in the bin. Like I was so casually just destructive when it came to my work, because I was very much like, cool, I've done that, now on to the next thing. Cool, I've done that, now on to the next thing. And she made me stop because she focused on this little bit that I hadn't quite considered of like, if you keep kind of like wiping out the past things you've done, whether they're mistakes or not, you have no concept of how far you've come, and you have no concept of the ground you've explored.
Yeah.
And
Wise
you
woman.
can find yourself, she is a wise woman. She's a very wise woman. Which is probably why I'm still here.
It absolutely is.
Yeah. And but like, yeah, she kind of had this beautiful effect on me. And then I realized that like, even in the most kind of like slightly selfish sense, you have no way of knowing if you're going in circles. If you keep kind of sweeping away the stuff that you've done before and paying no attention to it, you don't know if you're walking over ground you've already walked or solving problems you've already solved. So yeah, that's the hardest bit for me.
I love that. That's really, really interesting. And I think it's especially interesting coming from you because you are the first guest we've had that's actually had something published. I'm just
cool.
Hannah. People going through poets. Yeah,
Obviously, Rosa had her novel.
No, she's still going through editing at the minute.
Oh,
she's not published yet. She's still with her editor. So you are, and Faye was also going through publishing with the Apple, but she's not out yet.
Yeah.
So the first official, has book in hand guest we've had.
Yeah.
So looking ahead to our next question, which I think would be really interesting to hear from you, is how important is the relationship between writer and editor in your opinion? How have you found it? Were your experiences different with your different collections?
Yes. A good editor is like, this is going to be the most like middle-aged thing to say in the world. A good editor is like a really high interest savings account. Like, you have one, like, never ever 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 let it go ever. Just keep putting everything you got into that account. Just keep sending them that way, because when you find someone that gets not only what you're doing but who you are, and then when you change and you explore new ground, new territories, are willing to kind of like make that transition and come with you, that is like I have maybe 3 people, possibly 3 people on the planet who I've found, and I've sent my work to a lot of editors. And funny enough, neither of them actually edited either. And no, that's not quite true. 2 of them, no, all 3 of them informally kind of had, I'm thinking now, all 3 of them informally had eyes on the poems, but they weren't my editors. They were editing other people. And I was just like, you're amazing. Can you have a look at this for me? And then they said yes. So I will shout out all 3 of them. Noor Shaba, who is a phenomenal poet in her own right. Her first collection, Litanies, I think it was like reviewed by like Rory Waterman in the TLS. It was just like, it's powerful. And she has this beautiful blend of like the kind of a classic and the contemporary in ways that I'm still really envious of. Like, she can do stuff that I'm just like, damn it, sis. Nailed it. Another one is Sanafshan, who, again, she is phenomenal poet, but like in the kind of Byronic Ted Hughesian school. Like, she's absolutely unafraid to be like, I'm going to write a 200-line poem on like a meditation of nature and death, and you're like, oh dear, is this going to be wanky? And you read it and it's some of the most beautiful shit you've ever read, and you're like, how and then you realize that like, how is a stupid question. It's been done for hundreds of years. It's just that people have stopped paying attention to how it's done, and she continues to pay attention. The third is Gregory Ledbetter, who, again, phenomenal poet, but also is professor of poetry at Birmingham City University. Shout out BCU. Did my BA and my MA there. Is one of the few people who could like talk about Wordsworth and Wu-Tang like in the same conversation with like equal amounts of like credulity. Very, very, very cool guy. And woke me up in my BA by politely explaining that the Sex Pistols and the Romantic Poets had a lot more in common than we'd like to think, including the fact that they were similar ages, which was a very, very interesting conversation that we had, that definitely turned me on to the Romantic Poets in a way that I had absolutely not been before. I had been like 99% of the people and just gone, oh no, don't want to do anything to do with Shelley. And now I work for the Keats Shelley Trust, so yeah. It worked. It was a good sales pitch.
Probably that.
Yeah. And those 3 phenomenal people, and understand like not only what you're trying to do with a poem, like almost weirdly inherently, like, you don't need to tell them what your aim is. They will tell you what your aim was and whether you're meeting it. Give things room to breathe. I'm not afraid of experimentation. We'll kind of ask you that key question, which is the basis of my editing practice when I'm editing other people's work. When somebody puts a poem in front of me, I'm like, okay, what do you want this poem to achieve? Like, what's your aim here? What do you want the reader to feel? Because that's it at the end of the day. An editor's job is not to go, is this a good poem? Is this a bad poem? Is this a poem I'd want to read? Is this a poem I like? We put all of that to one side. Being an editor myself has helped the practice of dealing with editors massively. Because I'm like, oh, that's what you want. Okay, so me waffling for absolutely ages about, you know, whether to break a line here or there is completely irrelevant to you. You're interested in why I'd want to break a line in the first place in the middle of that image. Right, okay, now I understand. So yeah, it's difficult. That being said, the 2 publishers that I've published with, Burning Eye Books and Broken Sleep Books, are wonderful. They're wonderful little indie publishers. Little and indie being a strange thing because they're now much bigger than they were when I published with them. Both, which is good. Nothing to do with me, just time. But they have a very hands-off approach, like very, very hands-off. So effectively, I think it was Clive who was editing my work, and he basically just made sure it was like basically just proofread, asked me about what I wanted to kind of achieve with the work, whether I felt like it was being achieved that way, pointed out if there were any issues with kind of like pagination and structure. He was kind of there to ask. The first book, I did a lot of experimentation with form, so often I was kind of sending stuff to him going, is it possible to print a poem in a perfect circle? It's like, yeah, that's cool. If you can find a way to make a poem in a perfect circle. It's like, and then there'd be a break in the messaging and be like, have you found a way to make a poem in a perfect circle? I'm like, yes, I have, Clive. I will send it to you. I'll see if it works. So yeah, it was kind of like testing the boundaries. I wanted the world, and I still do. Like, I'm difficult with publishers just because the books that I aim towards are some of the books that, you know, have kind of broken the mold in pretty much every way. My concept of a magnum opus is Olio by Tahim Burgess, and that is the purest poetic conception I can ever think of. Like, everything from, like, the guy invented brand new forms. He had it printed in a format that no poetry book has ever been printed in, so he had to go to a music manuscript like publisher. He has poems that are designed to kind of be cut out and origamied and structured in order to be kind of understood in their purest sense. Like, he really kind of went out there, and I'm just being like, can I print this in a grid? And like, the grid, and they're like, yeah, you can do that.
You got your circle and your grid, and you were like, good, job done. I'm happy.
Done, yeah. So like, yeah. So I aim for the what was the thing? Aim for the stars, and even if you miss, aim for the, what was it? Aim for the
moon, and if you don't get it, at least you've got the stars. That used to be the what is it? The tagline of my high school. Yeah,
that's brilliant.
I know. I was like, I'm gonna get that tattooed on me one day. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, Oscar Wilde. He is Oscar Wilde, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Has wild energy.
Has wild energy. It does have wild energy. But yeah, no, I'm very much in that kind of that vein. Like, I have failed more in my experiments than I have ever succeeded.
But you've succeeded.
I've succeeded,
yeah.
And you just keep trying.
Yeah.
And every time you fail, you're like, oh, okay, you can't do it that way. That's brilliant. That's one thing to tick off the list.
Yeah.
So you just fail faster, and eventually you get really good at stuff.
I love that. Yeah.
And that's why editors are great, because you want somebody who you're just like, okay, they won't ghost you after you send them like the 9th edit of the same poem that's not working. They'll just be like, okay, what have you changed this time to make it? Because that's a beautiful thing that, like, Sana and Norsh, like, I call them my poetry sisters, even though I probably should call them more often than I call them. Just because, like, when we were in the hot house of the MA together, like, we worked on each other's work constantly, and we were brutal with how we kind of worked with each other, and we held nothing back. And it made us much, much, much better poets, because you need somebody who would, like, you know, hold you by the hand and go, with all the love in the world, that is shit, just stop.
Yeah, you do, it's true.
Absolutely.
And I always used to say, okay, what have you changed to make it worth reading again? And at first I was like, oh, all right, steady on. But after a while, I'm just like, no, that's a damn good question. We ran a poetry magazine together, and I was publishing manager, they were editors, because after about a week, I'm like, I am not an editor of a poetry magazine. That involves a lot more reading bad poetry than I can capably do to keep my sanity. So I just made sure it turned into a book in a timely manner and went out to people. But they were phenomenal editors and had infinite patience, but there was very much a thing of like, okay, they were like 3 lines in, I can tell. I'm like, fuck off, you can't tell 3 lines in. That's just hard. You're saying that to save time. So I sat down to myself, and I'm literally like, nope, 3 lines in, you can.
That's it.
you can tell, damn it. I was like, what does that mean for my work? It means that if I'm not doing something within the first 3 lines, what's the fucking point of the poem? And I'm like, oh, damn.
That's a good bit of advice.
I feel like we start writing down a cheat sheet of like Adrian's one-liners because you've given us so many
You have
so
actually,
far,
yeah.
and I'm just sat here like, there's a reason that I invited you. I'm so glad. Can I just take us off piece slightly because I'm really curious. Last week we spoke to Gareth who edits novels, and I was just wondering. I'm not going to ask you the difference between editing a novel and poetry, but when you're editing poetry, what do you look for? What are like your like? I know you've kind of covered it, but it's like a sort of almost like cheat sheet as an editor. What are you? I'm going for like raw, like someone's handed you a piece of work and it's like it's good. Like you're happy to. It's not like because like you said, if it's guff, you're going to hand it back and be like, stop and figure this out. But yeah, what's your sort of process? What's your checklist with things?
The first thing I look for is the music. If I'm reading a poem for the first time, I'll most likely read it out loud, which can make some people uncomfortable, particularly if they hand it to me in person.
I will be doing that with you then.
I'm like,
I'll send it over. Yeah.
There's a point where I'm just kind of like, not being funny, but if you didn't want your poetry read aloud, like, that's what it's for. Like, even if it's just your internal voice, you're still hearing it, right? So let's hear it. So I'll read it back to them. So yeah, and if it's got music, I'll keep going. If something stumbles or doesn't feel right, that for me is like a bum note, and I'm like, okay, why is that there in that phrase? In the same way, like when you're listening to music, you're like, that's discordant, that's in the wrong key. Second, I think I will look for if in the first stanza or the first collection of lines, there is a kind of a pillar image, something that kind of, image is the wrong word. Image is definitely the wrong word, and I'll chastise myself for that because I've literally just been doing the poetics of like visual impairment and restructuring poetics of poets to stop focusing on the visual, and yet we use our language when we talk about poetics continuously around imagery and symbolism, and none of that makes any difference when you're writing for a visually impaired audience, particularly poets who've been blind from birth. Though it is good fun to try and describe a bus to somebody who's no concept of what a bus could look like. That's a poetic challenge that just breeds some just beautiful work in like pure surrealism, but just by taking things and extrapolating them. Anyway, I'm getting myself off piece now. The idea like that makes the first stanza, first bit of a poem kind of like shine is that's one of the kind of second thing I'm looking for. And it doesn't have to be much, like sometimes just the tone of something. There's a poem called The Breakfast, and I can't remember who it's by, but it will pop up eventually. And it's super simple conceptually, super simple in terms of its structure as well. It's just a set of single clause actions. He opens the paper, he butters his bread, he lifts the spoon to his cup. Not lifts the spoon to his cup because that would be too long. I think it's literally single clause. He does this, she does that. He does this, she does that. But it builds this almost like choreography of what you learn is eventually a breakup. A wordless breakup, but a breakup. And the structure of it in these snapshots becomes apparent. And then you read it again and you realize that the snapshots are from a particular point of view. Certain actions are personalized and other actions are distant from you. They're being observed. And you read it again and you realize, oh, it's from her point of view. And you realize all the minutiae is his. All of it's been focused on, all the tiny little infinitesimal things are being focused on his actions, not her actions. He's almost forgotten what she ate. But, he ate half of his boiled egg, that sort of thing. And then you realize that it's from her perspective. It's the memory of that breakup just broken into almost like second by second snapshots of action. Now, the poem doesn't preamble itself. It just doesn't. It's not called The Breakup. It's called The Breakfast. But everything the poem is does that, and you just get it. Like, it just is. There's not like a, you can talk about what it means, you can talk about, the choices made, but the feeling that you get of this kind of like this pivotal moment that's pivotal to the poet only, but picked over in minutia. What could I have said wrong? What could I have done differently? Was there a tell? And you never know entirely. I say breakup because that's my perspective. There are better poets than me who've gone, oh, well, this is the last time she sees her lover, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a breakup. It could be the last time you've seen her live. Let's deal into the poet's backstory. And they were writing at a time, where there was political turmoil in their country and people were being disappeared. Maybe it was in response to that. We don't know because they never said, but they didn't need to because the poem's there. It exists as this thing. And like, as an editor, you see something like that and you're like, okay, now that is what I want. If you've got that tension in your chest where you're just like, this is something, I'm not even sure what it is, but it's something.
Yeah, it's like there's is it Simon Armitage who does like His Belongings or something, that very similar, like I did that in a poetry workshop with Anthony Dunn, and that like blew my mind. I was like, how have I not seen this before? But it's very sort of similar vibes of a enigmatic symbolism and like a lot of grief. That's in it.
Enigmatic, we're looking for the enigmatic, because a poem isn't just structured stuff. It's not just elevated language. It is something more than the sum of its parts, and you don't always have to know what that more is. You just kind of have to know it's there. And if you can find that as an editor, you're like, okay, this is worth the work. Even if you can see other problems, and often there are, your poem very rarely sits perfectly on the page, first, second, third, fourth time. But yeah,
I love that.
So,
do you want to put us back on piece, Tanner, with the next question before I take us away?
No, well, I mean, I feel like a lot of what you've said has been quite implicit anyway in answering this question, but really, what difference can a good editor make on a piece of writing then, whether that's poetry or prose? What impact does a good editor have?
I'd say a huge impact, simply because you're not writing entirely for yourself. Being a poet can feel like a very personal endeavor, and truly, and it really, really is. You're finding ways to kind of crystallize your thought, your feeling, your perspective on the world, and kind of you find ways to universalize it. But that universalization is what makes a poem work, right? So that editor being outside of you and external, someone who understands the rules of the game that you're playing together, but doesn't necessarily have your motivations and intentions, can kind of tell you back like a mirror what's working and what's not. And that's the key thing here. It is this idea that what you're trying to do in your poetry is more than just put out how you feel. It is to reach into somebody else's experience and kind of like pour your own in. You want them to think of, oh gosh, somebody way smarter than me. It's like one of the reasons Shakespeare is a phenomenal poet is because you can look at your lover and think of Sonnet 140. Like, there's no connection between those two things other than the poem itself. But like, it's just either nothing. Like, the sun means more to you as a person looking at your beloved than it did to him when he was writing about his beloved. And that's what an editor has the capability of doing. It's like, how do we build this in such a way that it's not just a poem about my love, it's a poem about all love, a poem that will reach across and connect with a reader in such a way that they'll think of their passionate experience, they'll think of their sorrow, they'll think of their loss, their hope, not just try and understand what mine is.
Yeah. That can be good. Like, I wonder if you as a teacher struggle with like trying to get that translation to kids, because they're being taught to kind of just like translate the poem in the exam sheet to fit the criteria that's been set by the exam board. And it's probably why a lot of people step away from poetry, because they've had to think about how they're going to get points out of poetry rather than actually feeling something from
It's
it.
exactly that. Yeah. I think as well, kind of the things that you're saying here, it's so true. We're trying to find ways to make it resonate with young people as well, because obviously Shakespeare's on the national curriculum, and we have to deliver an anthology of poetry as well. So that's 15 poems, but there's such a range. We've got romantic period right up to contemporary. But what I would say is, because we have to teach it in such a formulaic way so that they do pass that exam, it takes all thought and feeling out of it. So I really tried to teach in a way similar to what you said. Well, how can we connect with that poet kind of through time? How is that message kind of transcending through time and space kind of thing? And every single poem that we study is crafted in such a beautiful way that there's something they can cling on to. There's some kind of thread that's still hanging and that they can grab to, and it's just finding that thread. And a lot of kids say that they hate poetry, but they don't. They've not found the poem for them that they can cling to, that resonates with them. And
100%.
I think that's it. When we was talking about this a little bit earlier on, in that writing poetry can be quite an isolating experience, but it's interesting to kind of think about it in that point of view. It's the first time you're giving your creation to somebody else and thinking about then showcasing it to the wider world, and the pressure that comes with that, the vulnerability, it's hard, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. It's one of the reasons that I will write about almost anything but myself.
Yeah.
I for years I like to, I'd kind of joke around and say, it's because I'm the least interesting thing in any given room. That the job of the poet is to kind of just to measure the tone, the room tone, as it were, kind of understand the situation from the outside. Our job is to crystallize and make more beautiful what is already beautiful, but maybe unnoticed. But maybe the real answer is that the more of myself I give, the less I have for myself. And giving it in a way that is imperfect to the cause or imperfect to the intention, like, it's already out there. Like the running joke that I've always had with people who are like, every open micer has the dude who stands up and he's like, my awkward sex poem. I'm like, cool. How many of those can you write? Are you just gonna keep having awkward sex, or like what? Like, like how many times can you write the same structure? Would it have not made more sense to take elements of that experience and scatter them amongst poems about fear, about consent, about the concept of self, about masculinity, and take each of these images and these experiences and just pepper them, add them as seasoning. Yourself is seasoning for the poem. It shouldn't just be the whole poem.
That's brilliant advice.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely evident in 5,000 Hertz. Like, it's really fun, because I saw you recently and we were talking about what my favourite poem was, which was a very personal poem to you. But actually, when you're talking like this, I'm just reflecting on it and thinking, there are threads of you in sort of everything, which is really nice. Whether I feel like I'm sat beside you watching a scene unfold, or whether like you're narrating, like you're narrating actively, it's just really beautiful. So yeah, you definitely the self is the seasoning is a good line. Coming back to your books, I think an interesting question I want to ask you is, and you sort of alluded to it slightly earlier, is have you ever experienced tension in the editing process, and how do you overcome this? And I guess the thing I'd be interested to hear from is both from you as a creative and then from you as an editor, just both sides.
Massively. Bit of both. So as a creator, often what I wanted to do, how I was saying that it's really difficult to kill your darlings. Sometimes a particular experiment will just grip me and I can't let it go, and I really struggle. And often the person who will pry that experiment out of my hands so I can use my hands for something else will be a good editor. And it will have to be like a reasoned argument that will usually get me through, if not threats of violence. No, I'm joking. But it's it can be really, really difficult, because again, it's that passion. When you spent 3 or 4 weeks on something, the idea of just letting it kind of go to one side, and admitting that at that moment in time you don't have the capability to take it to where it needs to be. Maybe in the future you will, but not right now. Not for this book, not for this deadline, not for this publisher. That takes somebody measured from the outside to do it, and who knows you well enough that they can do it without you just flipping the table and walking away. that is something I understood from the writing point of view, which is something directly that I bring in on the editing point of view. Like, the most tragic poem for me is a poem that is clearly personal, deeply so, and it means something, even if it's just obliquely. You just get that sense that, like, this is a key to something, and a poet needs to get it to work for reasons that are outside of just the book, outside of just its line's going to hit right, but it just doesn't. And it just doesn't because of choices they've made, decisions that they've made earlier on in the poem, things that they aren't willing to let go of, maybe a formal choice that just doesn't quite work. The problem with being personally connected, and another issue kind of, with pouring too much of yourself into a poem, is that these parts need to be well lubricated to move apart. You need to be able to take that one out and put this one in to see if it works. If you're all gummed up in there, there's no movement, and the poem's static, and it becomes ossified. It can get stuck as itself. And you know what? Sometimes that's brilliant. Some of Wilfred Owen's poems are intensely, almost like diarifically personal poems. They're very much exactly what he wrote in that trench at that time. No changes, no edits, sometimes even with spelling mistakes, even if you look at the initial kind of publications. And people kind of like held him up on a pedestal for that, and he was very much like, I'm not changing it, I'm not editing it, that was me in that moment in time. So it can work. That ossified sense of stuff can work. But not all of his poems are like that. And he even has some poems that he published. I'm like, yeah, that maybe could have done with a tweak, my guy. Like, maybe you've defeated purpose here. You've had scholars arguing over, things that you've basically just kind of gone, I can't remember what I meant at the time, but I was kind of getting shelled, so I didn't really think about it. And you're like, okay, that's maybe not the best way to put a poem out in the world. So when I get poets who have created something and I'm like, you wrote this under fire, maybe in the tense emotional state, or in the aftermath of something before the kind of the sky had cooled, whatever, but like it's there and it's raw, and they're very stuck to that rawness and that there-ness, but that there-ness and the rawness is getting in the way of it being like a really strong poem. That can be so difficult. I'm like, do you want this poem, or do you want the best version of this poem that can come in?
Yeah.
And sometimes they will just say, I want this as it is. Even if I know it can be stronger, I want this as it is. And I'll have to go, okay, then my work on this one's done. Let's have a look at the next one. Sometimes they will be like, okay, I'll go away. How about a version of this? What could a version of this look like that is more itself? And then I can go, all right, cool, I can work with that. Very rarely they'll say, cool, let's flip the table, let's go. Let's and I'll be like, all right, sorry, my bad. Call me if you need me, sort of thing. But it can be really, really difficult. Really, really, really difficult. But you got to understand that, like, your job as an editor is get that poem ready for the outside world. You got to lace up its boots. You got to make sure it's dressed properly. It's got its shirt tucked in. Because once it's out in the world, it doesn't belong to the poet anymore. I can't remember who they are, but their poem was about their HIV diagnosis, and they're kind of coming to terms with what that meant to be alive with a death sentence, what that meant to be alive with a death sentence, and how living and unliving were connected. Beautiful poem, like brain breaking. Put the book down, think about it for 24 hours, good poem. That became a protest poem because it has these undeniable kind of like tones and timbres of just resistance, like beautiful. Our backs against the wall, we're going to go down swinging. We will not give up against this resistance. And it became a resistance poem to the point where it's like shouted at BLM marches. And they were like, well, I wrote this about this, but it's not my poem anymore. So you say it's a resistance poem, it's a resistance poem now.
Yeah, it's transformed.
It's transformed. And, some poets might gall at that, but that's the way the world works. And editor's job is to get that poem ready for that experience. Like, once it's out there, it's out there. You just got to make sure that it's intentional. The flip side of this is a poem that I've wrote about, or poet that I've wrote about. There's poet called Tobe de las Rivas, who may or may not be a little bit on the right side of things, let's shall we say, has a lot of slightly fascist adjacent imagery in his work and was rightly called out for it. But did this thing of like, well, if you interpret that, I can't help but you interpret it, I can't help that. To which people go, like, that's not how poetry works, son. Like, you can put it out there, but like it becomes then your job to kind of go, maybe if I put this in a poem, it could be interpreted as a giant flag for fascism. Maybe I should not do that as a thing. And when you find out that it's been done as a thing, you challenge it. You don't go, well, it's all up for interpretation, because you put yourself in a little bit of trouble doing that. In the same way that, like, the previous poet, they were like, well, I wrote the poem about this, but I recognize that it's being perceived in this way, and this is how I feel about it. Not challenging, not saying you're wrong, but like, this is my intention, this is the perception. He didn't do that. So I wrote Oh Brother, Where Lies Your White City in his style. So after him, exploring some of these images and inverting them for my own intentions, kind of questioning him of like, okay, cool. So you say that you're being misinterpreted, but here might be why you're being misinterpreted in a language that you might be able to understand because it's super similar to your own. So it's a difficult one. Again, there's a part of my brain that's just like, an editor really should have stepped in and been like, maybe don't call your like book Black Sun while there are tiki torch marching people with like the Nazi Sonnerad painted on their shields, like on the literal news. Maybe don't do that.
Yeah, a bit of an awareness, sort of missing connection there.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really, really interesting. So thank you for sharing that insight.
Yeah. We've reached our last question, haven't we? We asked this to all our guests. We like to punish people. Yeah, it's the hardest question you'll ever be asked. But just in terms of recommendations, what is your favourite book?
Oh gosh, like in all of literature.
Yes. Yeah.
I can tell you what my favourite book this month is.
Fair.
So I did actually prepare for this question. What might be one of my favourite books ever is Jorge Luis Borges' Poems of the Night, which I actually have here if you want to see.
Very nice.
Yeah, okay.
Nice cover.
Second only to Terence Hayes' American Sonnets from My Past and Future, Assassin. There's a sequence of sonnets in We Are Always and Forever Ending, which is a form kind of after him, because he writes in crowns of sonnets, but I like the idea of a hollow crown. So I built one. So a crown of sonnets is where each of the sonnets is 14 sonnets, and a 15th sonnet, which is the jewel of the crown, is made up of comprised lines of each of the 14 sonnets. So in a crown, like the start of the first line of the first sonnet is original, but the first line of the second sonnet is the last line of the first sonnet, and continuing. Again, arbitrary choices to make your life difficult, but you can kind of create some good art. And I was like, all right, so let's make a hollow crown. Let's make a crown of sonnets where the end poem is actually at the center. So you create a situation where the first half of the middle sonnet you have contextual framing for. You know where those lines have come from. You know what they mean within the context of the poems that they're in. But the other half of the sonnet, after the volta, you have no idea where these lines are coming from. So you have to read the other 7 to kind of understand how they got to where they got to. And that the entire concept was just taken from reading American Sonnets from My Past and Future, Assassin. Just how he played with playing a sonnet on the page, and how writing a sonnet as a cathartic experience. He has one to Donald Trump, which is just the most beautifully infantile expletives, but like wrapped in like a perfect sonnet form. And I'm just like, the work it took to get like, you know, an ABBC rhyme with like Beetle Bum in it. Like, it's just phenomenal to me.
Yep.
Never be a bad thing. And then of course, I guess tied third because I'm awkward. Fearsome by Douglas Kearney, which is really hard to get. I think it's published by like Red Hen Press, but it's like, oh man, it'll break your brain, but at the same time, you won't write the same way after you've read it. Like when you see like how he puts stuff on the page, and then it just makes freaking sense, man. Like it just does stuff, and you're like, oh yeah, you can totally do that. Why have I never done that before?
Yeah.
And then you'll want to just do that the whole time.
That sounds
and
great.
it'll be really, really, really subtle things, not just the huge ones, really, really subtle things. But I won't spoil it. Explore it. It's good fun.
That sounds good.
All good recommendations. Thank you very much. We will add those to our TVRs, which are going so much longer as we keep having more guests on the show.
Yeah.
But this has been fantastic, Adrian. Thank you for spending the time with us and for just being so eloquent in all your explanations. It's been beautiful to listen to.
Yeah, it really has. And just, you've got some absolute classic one-liners in this that we're going to snip it and, you know, just
do a
paint
lots
it
of
on the
quick
wall,
shots.
Animal Farm style, and just live by it. So you've given some really, really amazing insights there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
You're
you.
very welcome. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
Lovely stuff. Well, that was an absolute treat. If I do say something, I really enjoyed that conversation with Adrian.
Yes, I just feel very lulled by his voice after that. Like, he's got the perfect kind of poetic voice, hasn't he?
Very soothing, isn't it?
Brilliant.
Yeah.
But also, just fantastic insight. He's just got so much knowledge, hasn't he, about poetry? Like, I felt a bit, I don't know, caught off guard a little bit. I was like, I don't know any of these. I'm supposed to be an English specialist, but hey.
No, he's like a mine. It's just like seams of just incredibly gorgeous lines. Like there's so many moments where we were just like, I mean, just the marketer in me was like, so like what's the word I want to use? I don't know. It just sounds very odd, but I was just like, that will click well for social media. Just because there's so many like juicy little bites of him that I was just like, I want to give this away and like share with people.
God, there were so many. I think as well, I was just blown away by his knowledge of form. Like, that's something that I've never stuck to when it comes to writing poetry.
Yes.
But he clearly does, and I actually think that's a really interesting approach, isn't it? Sometimes if you're struggling, maybe take a form and think how you can maybe fit your work to that instead.
Yeah.
Well, maybe
we'll see how things feel.
Complete wisdom. Lovely.
Yeah,
loved
love
it.
the time. I mean, I know we do, and the thing is, we do listen back to our interviews because we both. I think there's a very different thing that I've learnt through this process of being the interviewer and being the active listener, and then being just like the nice passive, like using it to like we've talked to people who use this project like podcast to actually work to and stuff. I have a friend who's like starting to write, and she was up the other week, and we studied at uni together, and she was just like, oh, I really want to do it. And I was like, yeah, just listen whenever you have the chance. And she's like, no, I want to sit down and I want to have it on like either on open on YouTube or over the speaker, but I want to be able to sit and listen to it and actually like write as I go along and like make notes and like really study with it. And I was just sat there like, that's so nice that like someone I've studied with and worked with in uni is now like taking the work that I've worked on and wants to use it. I think Adrian, she's gonna like it a lot. I was I think so just wonderful stuff.
Some really brilliant just ideas coming from that conversation, and as well it was really insightful to hear from somebody who's had 2 books published, and the editing process that goes into that, and almost again the brutality that you need to bring to that process. So on the back of that, shall we kind of think about what we're going to do for the week ahead then, creative tasks that we can set?
I think we're at the midpoint now. I think this is when you should start thinking about draft 2, because I think building on Gareth's talk about self-editing and that's like self-editorial eye, and then the sort of tips and tricks Adrian shared with us today about being that ruthless and having that engagement with your own work. I think it doesn't have to be a full second draft, but this is the kind of time whether you start plotting it or you start making notes, or whether now's the time to actually just go back and reread your first draft with the accompanying notes and be like, okay, what have I addressed? I think it's second draft time, however people want to approach that.
No, I agree. I think as well, when you are approaching that second draft, just the phrase "kill your darlings" just really stuck with me. I thought that was
It resonated. I saw your little eye sparkle.
Yeah, just a brilliant way of phrasing it, because we all do when we come up with that little bit of gold, if it's in a poem or if it's like a character description or paragraph that we really, really love. But in actual fact, it just doesn't fit, or it's just not doing what you want it to do. You've got to kill it. You've got to, which of your darlings are you going to kill? And I just thought, God, that's exactly it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Been a bit more brutal. There are so many things in my novel that I'm really happy with and that I love, but in actual fact, they are superfluous. It's superfluous content. I don't need it. It's not getting the job done. It's waffle. So in actual fact, it can go, but yeah. Gotta kill your darlings. That'll be a good piece of advice for you though as well, won't it, in terms of poetry?
I think Kill Your Darlings for me strips back to like not just poems in entirety, but also like lines, and just being much more aware of the stuff I'm writing, and like not just putting in a word or a phrase because it rhymes or it balances the meter, like actually having the attention to be like, that's great, but let's put this to a side. And like it was season 1 we talked to someone, can't remember. Season 1 feels a long time. I don't know you, it feels a while ago. They talked about like breaking up your poems line by line, I think.
Oh yeah.
Is that Faye?
Yeah. Yes.
And I just think maybe this is a time to actually go back to that activity and like split down to lines and be like, what are the key lines? What am I wanting to share in this? What's the narrative? What's the story of this poem? And what's the experience of this poem that I want to translate? And I think killing your darlings, actually being brutal and being like, right, I have 12 lines of good poetry here, but I have 4 lines of excellent poetry. Okay, let's just like, what can I make the good excellent, or does the good need to just go away and like marinate for a little bit?
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
And then final thing. So we've got a second draft. We've got to go through and kill your darlings in that second draft. Final one. Accountability partner.
Yeah, I think this is the time we've sort of encouraged people along the way to pick up people and share a community. And I know that takes a long time for some people. I know writing. I mean, we very rarely share writing. We share performance or finished or, in our opinion, polished writing. Between us two, we don't really share drafts.
No, we don't actually.
Which is, we both, as we discussed earlier, we've got enough on. We don't need to add more criticism to our lives. But maybe this is a time now, whether you had an accountability partner you found last week for last week's task, or whether you want to like invite someone now, whether it's a friend or a family member, or like someone whose opinion really matters to you in a writing. Well, like Adrian has been encouraging me for ages to send him work, and I have just absolutely dragged my feet because I really respect him and like his opinion matters, and I know that he would be honest, which is what I want. But at the same time,
it's daunting.
It's so daunting. I mean, like reading his work and like I'm just sat there like, okay, maybe we can talk about this.
I know what you mean.
So maybe this is the time to actually officially. This is a milestone to invite someone in to look at your work, whoever you want, and also maybe just being like willing to accept the criticism, but also willing to fight it. Because I think sometimes you put there and you're like, well, if they're saying this, it must be true. And I think there's an element of like, actually, if you disagree with them, politely, don't become aggressive, because like definitely some people can be upset about with their writings challenged. Take the time to be like, well, no, this is what I think and here's where I'm coming at, and they go, oh, I hadn't even considered that perspective. Okay, with that lens that makes it entirely different, but that lens isn't written in for like an outsider to read, so how can we weave that in much more clearly?
Definitely make sure you've got an accountability partner, so anybody who you can share that work with and who might share work with you, vice versa, but who you feel comfortable having those kind of constructive conversations with. And if you don't agree with what they're saying, who you feel comfortable to say, actually, can I challenge you on that, or can I get more information on that? Because there's nothing worse than feeling like you've got to bite your tongue around somebody when you're talking about creative work. I mean, we run creative projects together. We don't share each other's work, but we run Inkspill, and it's a creative thing. And so we've always very much kind of had the relationship of, if we're not happy with something, or if we're wanting to do something, we communicate that to each other. It makes it impossible to work with someone if you can't do that.
No. I was watching a video on TikTok that was like, how do you get ahead in your career? And it was this like career coach, and she just said, be willing to be the one to have the hard conversations, because no one likes confrontation. And like Inkspill has run well because we're often quite blunt with each other. And that doesn't mean we're rude or like cruel, but we'll be like, I'm struggling with this, what do you think? I'm missing this, how can, like, what can we do? And more often the answer that comes back is, I agree, how can I help you?
Let's fix it kind of thing.
Why that we're, so Inkspill 20 is upcoming / in the past, but the fact that we've hit the big 2-0 is quite significant. And when we started it, we were like, we'll see how it goes. We'll see what we like. So yeah, really cool stuff.
So the moral of the story is have someone who you can work well with.
Yes.
And start your second drafts and kill your darlings, but in a metaphorical sense.
Yeah, we're not.
Don't kill your husbands/wives/ anyone's.
Let's not kill anyone
except for our words. Shall we call it a day?
Yeah.
Shall we end that one there?
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you. I was going to say thank you very much, Hannah.
You're so welcome, Abby.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for sitting and
Not
chatting.
Adrian, Hannah.
Yeah. Obviously, huge thanks to Adrian.
God, yeah, massive thank you.
That was such a wonderful conversation to have. Thanks to us for being here. Thanks to you for joining.
Thanks for Watson for your cheerleading in the background.
Yeah, he's been grinding away.
He's really doing a good job.
And we will see you next week, where we'll be joined by our last guest of season 2.
Yeah.
Do you want to name drop
we
this?
can name drop. Okay, we've got Colleen Wood joining us next week, and we cannot wait. Like, I was fangirling a little bit because we watched Colleen perform, didn't we? And we've
July last year.
It was a while ago, but I remember just seeing him, and we actually had that conversation of we need this man when we start this podcast, whenever that might be.
Yeah,
this man would make a great guest.
Which at the time felt like a really weird, like, we start a podcast, and then by the end of the year we're like, we're starting a podcast.
Yeah. So get that man in the diary. So it's brilliant.
It's a treat.
Can't wait for that. But yeah, we'll see you next week, and thank you very much for listening.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.